Hey, all right, let's do this. Now, I'm going to prove the existence of God. I know what you're thinking. You don't believe me. You don't think I can do this because no one's actually really ever done that before. But believe me, I'm going to do this right now. So the first thing you need to do in order to understand the existence of God is please separate yourself from the Abrahamic timeline. We're talking about biblical, we're talking about Judaism moving to Christianity, moving to Islam, with all the other offshoots that you find, Rastafarianism, Mormonism, you name it, Jehovah's Witness. That timeline, Abrahamic, is generally what I find when people talk about God on either side of the fence, is what they're referring to. You ask an atheist to define God, they generally do it in that kind of terminology. That is a very, very sad and limited scope of the understanding of God. God itself is a word with Germanic histories, and it was repurposed to be used in biblical terminology as we moved through the translations. That is something that I feel like the Abrahamic timeline has been very proficient at doing. You find stuff like the famous example, obviously, being Christmas Day, 25th of December. As we all know, it's kind of has more ties into pagan traditions and also Roman celebrations that they kind of adapted into the Christian timeline, whereas there's actually evidence that Jesus was not born around that time. It was more the sheep grazing in the winter, I think, was the main biblical passage that they kind of used to disprove that that wouldn't be the time that they'd be doing that. Anyway, so that's great. So we got this word God that's been repurposed in biblical terminology in Abrahamic, but God itself actually is used in English translations for many other cultures around the world, and to get really bogged down by this kind of Abrahamic understanding shows a huge lack of research, or at least effort or care about other world religions or beliefs or systems and philosophies. So what I'm going to do in order to prove to you that God does exist in some shape or form is that I'm going to give you 3 examples which are quite difficult to disagree with. Starting with my favorite religion of all time is Hinduism. Also keep in mind that it's the oldest practiced religion, predates Judaism and the entire Abrahamic timeline by a few thousands of years. So yes, when we think about Hinduism, and I know what people think, they think, oh, Jared, it's a polytheistic religion. There's more than one god. They have many gods. They actually have millions of gods, and that's true. But there's an overarching god. You see, there's this greater force that's more known as a supreme being, known as Brahman. Brahman is a pantheistic deity. You wouldn't really call it that so much, but it's a pantheistic concept that the entirety of everything, I'm talking freaking everything, the universe and the planets and the atoms, molecules, you, me, the space between us, literally everything encompasses into this umbrella term. Pantheists consider that God, and Brahman is the Hindu term for that. And you find it very similar to another Eastern philosophy created in China, very famous, the Taoism, Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, which is interchangeable, really, and that is another great concept when it comes to God. So understand this, that when you come along and go, God doesn't exist, and you say that to someone who is of Hindu, Vedic, Eastern timeline, what you're saying to them is, the universe doesn't exist. Now you see how silly that sounds? It sounds really silly. So when you're someone who's done their research or has a little more greater understanding on an Eastern perspective, it's a bit laughable, kind of embarrassing and silly when someone says, God doesn't exist, because it's like, then what's all this? So that's one example. The second example that I'm going to use is of a paganistic nature, and as time gone on, neo-paganism, contemporary paganism, Druidism, or perhaps the most famous is Wiccan, which has various beliefs about what the nature of God is, but it's a nature thing. Some are more specific. You get a lot of attention put towards the moon. You get a lot of attention put towards just general water or plants, but what it generally is, it's kind of undercurrents of energy that evolves and creates these systems that we have, the ecosystems, for example, like how everything feeds everything, how a plant will feed a herbivore, will feed a carnivore, will die and feed the plants. these beautiful ecosystems that are developed that are blatantly dependent on one another. The individualistic separation of beings doesn't actually make sense. You can see there's a greater system of work. It's nature worship, which is often synonymous to these kind of neo-paganistic ideas. So when you say, what is God to them? They say, yes, it's nature. So to say, when you go up to someone who is of a neo-paganistic tradition and you say, God doesn't exist, what you're saying to them is, nature doesn't exist. Very similar to the pantheistic, universe doesn't exist. I don't know about you, but I feel like nature does exist. I mean, I'm looking out this window here, I'm seeing these green plants, and nature can be applied to anything. Nature can even be applied to humans. We are a natural part of the evolution of the earth, despite what people may think or disregard us as. So that's great. The third and to me the most hilarious example that I'm going to give you is Pythagoreanism, which you probably know Pythagoras. We all learned about him in school with mathematics. What a lot of people don't know is that Pythagoras was actually a cult leader. He had a massive cult below him, the Pythagoreans, and as you would expect, they had a lot of weight put into numerology. They had a deep belief that mathematics was how you got into the thoughts of God and basically was interchangeable with God. You look at things like formulas that you could apply to absolutely anything and always get the same results, very reliable systems of logic. And sacred geometry is a fantastic example of how we can see that undeniably in the way that biology has created itself and evolved, and as well as just general cool shapes you find in nature, man. So the thing there, which is so funny, is that people say stuff like, God doesn't exist. So if you're Pythagorean, it's like saying, maths doesn't exist. And what's the funniest part is that atheists tend to say silly things, like they'll say, God doesn't exist. I believe in science. I believe in logic. Logic is actually, and mathematics are pretty much the same terminology. You can even use them quite interchangeably. Mathematics is logic. It's pretty much the a representation of logic in its rawest form. We use numbers to convey literal logic. So it's funny. So you're saying logic doesn't exist, and you can see how stupid that sounds. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds uneducated and frankly quite embarrassing for anyone to say that. Now, I just want to go into this again and quickly just remind everyone about the biblical terminology of God. That God has other names. Is it Elohim? I forget that, but Yahweh is probably the most common one that you'll find people saying. That was the God's name. And you look in Quran, the English translations will say God, but it was Allah, as we all know, which was a part of a polytheistic canon, as was Yahweh as well. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but it's important to note that these were separate gods. They weren't God. The name wasn't God. They never said, I am God. They might say, I am the one true God, because God's was a term, it was a word. But they had names, Yahweh. So when you're saying to someone, and if your understanding of God is biblical, instead of saying God doesn't exist, say Yahweh doesn't exist. Now you have a different debate. Now you're specifically targeting a group of understanding. I personally am not Christian or on the Abrahamic timeline, so I'm not bothered when someone says Yahweh doesn't exist. In my understanding, I don't really necessarily apply myself to that understanding of God either. Yahweh doesn't really exist in my interpretation of what God, the supreme being, is. But at least now you're arguing on the correct. You're consciously arguing on the correct platform. Whereas when you say this broad God doesn't exist, you're actually talking, now you're going to be looked at by people who are of Eastern tradition or ancient Greek tradition or paganistic tradition, who are going to look at you like you're a flippin' moron, because what you're saying just doesn't compute, and it just shows a super ignorance of what God actually can be in a potential manner and how it has been documented. And I'd like to point this out, that Hinduism predates the Bible, paganism predates the Bible, in fact terminology was based on someone who was not biblically inclined, and of course ancient Greek Platonism, but Neoplatonism as well, but Pythagoreans predates the Bible as well. So these are before the Bible. So when you say God doesn't exist, it's not like it just shows you just don't know what you're talking about, and it's very, very sad. So I just like to challenge atheists and non-believers of any form alike to rather use a specific terminology like Yahweh doesn't exist. Yes, okay, now you're actually saying what you meant to say, but you look like a fucking fool to the rest of us who have actually done a little more education on these concepts. So just think, or do some research. If you want to say the universe doesn't exist, then say it. Anyway, all of this can be read in the Janta Poison Bible, which is available on Amazon. I do recommend you get it because it goes into this terminology and helps you greater understanding of what God may or not be, but also how to exploit that, how to use that and apply that to yourself in a very practical, logical manner. We are a logic-based religion, so I highly, highly recommend you do that. And thank you for listening to me. I've been excited about doing this all day.